So that's good. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final keynote for today. What a kind of whirlwind of a day it's been. That those people who organized this conference did not let us stop. So this is your chance to take it all in. Fatih will be telling you everything you need to know. So that will be excellent. My name is Leslie Cormack, and I have the honor with the ambulance of having been on the panel on the program committee that organized the meeting 20 years ago. So it's of course I was a child, but it's a delight to see the staying power of some of the ideas, but also the changes that have taken place in that time. I'm also very excited by the young scholars who are here and that there is another generation carrying on with just the same complicated problems that we've had before. So I'm going to very briefly introduce Fatih Fan so that he can spend most of the time telling you the important material that he has rather than me just kibitzing at you. So Dr. Fatih Fan is a professor of history at Binghamton University in New York. He is, of course, a historian of science and of modern East Asia. He's the author, among other things, of the book British Nationalists in Qing China, Science, Empire, and Cultural Encounter, and has many important articles in a number of top history of science journals, including work on the global history of science. So today he's going to talk to us about Notes from Another Shore, thinking about global history of science. Fatih.
All right, can you hear me? People in the back? Sorry, I can't use this mic. The battery just died on me. So people back there can hear me okay. So all right, I have to time myself because I'm the last person standing between you and your afternoon beer. So I don't want to be the person like okay. So all right. Okay, I'll try to time myself, but my phone was okay. Yeah. All right, so here we're at this conference, the Circulating Knowledge, and so it's greatly honored and really super happy to be here. And today I have learned so many exciting things from you. So what I'm going to talk about, it might not sound like super new to many of you since you're already doing that. But I think it's probably still good. I kind of throw it off. So it's a really invitation for conversation. So hopefully there will be a little bit of time to talk about it. We can also talk over beer and stuff later. But in any case is that I cannot see you very well. So and I cannot read this very well because of my eyesight. So I'm wearing these new glasses. They look like goggles really, and because it's very thick. So my daughter said that you're wearing goggles. You look like a minion. What is minion? Must be George Clooney, but not to be despicable me. Anyway, so this is what happened. So I had to kind of stick to the kind of reading this way, and it's not I don't want to look at you. Is first of all I can't really see you anyway. Secondly, is that I would lose my face if I don't look at it. Okay. So let's start off with this. A few observations and premises. The first is that I think that post-colonial, global, and related terms are poorly defined. So post-colonial and global have become kind of bad categories for many of us. And so the second observation is post-colonial is often used in two or multiple different ways, but the two often most common is post-colonial refers to a particular historical period that is after the colonial period. So that is a post-colonial state, for example, refers to the state that came after the colonial one. But more commonly for us, post-colonial also refers to a scholarly approach, as in post-colonial studies. It refers to an ideological and intellectual response to what is defined as colonialism, or more broadly, coloniality. So here my main contention or kind of argument is that we need to have a space that is not traditional Eurocentric view, but that is also not simply post-colonial science studies, as we it's mostly that is most commonly we encountered in our field. So here's the paradox, and I think here I will highlight it. One is, so on one hand, as Amit Prasad has pointed out in his recent book, science studies still hasn't adequately confronted its colonial legacy. On the other hand, and this is my view, when it tries to, it tends to fall into a narrowly defined post-colonial/decolonial framework. So my argument is that we want to open up the field, open up the historical framework, and it will help us to adopt a more radical or more fundamental way of looking at science in global context. So it's like if you want to write global history science, is something where you have to think about. It's not simply being kind of trapped into this post-colonial and the colonial framework, which doesn't mean that they are not important or they're wrong, but there are certain tendencies as we currently practice them that somehow, in my view, confine the way we do global history science. So here's a brief genealogy about post-colonial history science or post-colonial science studies. In its early formation, post-colonial studies center on criticizing Western imperialism and colonialism through a set of critical theories. The trait that has continued until today. Much of its original focus was on the West. West, particularly Western intellectual and cultural production related to the colonial world. As such, post-colonial studies was different from the academic field of area studies because the latter emphasized the training and knowledge about non-Western languages, cultures, and societies. And therefore, in the field, we tend to see two different things. Whereas people study pre-modern non-Western science, they operate in a different world. They train area studies, and then you have post-colonial science. They tend to train in modern period, and they don't really talk to each other effectively, in my view, which I think is a problem. And you know what? It turns out that I forgot to do the slides. So here's like circulation knowledge, and we have to celebrate this conference, and therefore we celebrate. And then, so in terms of post-colonial studies, and so here's the field we tend to go with either Eurocentric or post-colonial, as currently the case. Increasingly, we have a younger scholar changing this. So here is that my argument is that this is what I just talked about, and then. So here's the paradox I just mentioned, and here's Eurocentric, which is becoming, since the field is so confined, means that it's either Eurocentric, especially in the modern period, and that's a traditional view, or we're trying to do more post-colonial infused approach. So it becomes, to some extent, that you're not a dog, you're a cat, but you don't want to be just like a dog or a cat. This is not what we want. We want to, if you want to be a sea cucumber, you can be a sea cucumber. So I want to be sea cucumbers, I want to be a sea cucumber. So here's about sea cucumbers. Okay. So it's early formation, right? We talk about post-colonial studies tend to start to the West, and then area studies that tend to trend in a different way. Now, soon, however, post-colonial studies found an audience and academic niche in area studies as well as in non-Western countries. The development proved intellectually fruitful. For example, post-colonial studies merged with subaltern studies, particularly South Asian studies and Latin American studies, and they produced trenchant criticisms of both post-colonialism and nationalism in these regions. By and large, however, post-colonial studies still throw their heaviest punches against what is taken to be Western imperialism, capitalism, and the military. And because science and technology have long been seen as the benchmark of Western modernity, they have become a subject of post-colonial critique. So in the 1990s, history science and STS absorbed the insights and approaches of post-colonial studies. And post-colonial techno-science became a prominent topic in science studies. In recent years, similar to some other disciplines, decolonization or decolonial studies have entered the discourse of science studies. The scholarly movement goes further than post-colonial studies in its express purpose of decolonizing both science and the history science. The premise is that modern science is grounded in Western epistemology and ontology, and the dominance or even hegemony of this knowledge regime has expanded with Western imperialism. In other words, the form and practice of modern science are deeply intertwined with colonialism and coloniality in world history. So decolonizing science, therefore, in this history, are therefore not simply an intellectual investigation. It is also a necessary form of a political action. So this is the general situation currently. Did I be too fast? Is it okay? Okay, yeah. All right. So now, okay, so here is what I just talked about. I'm always behind on slides for whatever reason. And so here's what I am going to talk about, right? So this, but next is that all of the arguments discussed above, I just talked about, are powerful and relevant. So they have helped us unpack the political dynamics and the power relations in science, both historically and in the contemporary world. However, there are also problems, or I would say tendencies probably, and limitations to these approaches. So I'll briefly go over them. It's a pretty long list, actually. So first, a persistent problem is that despite all its sophistication, these approaches still tend to prescribe the West/Rest dichotomy. So ultimately, post-colonial and the decolonial studies recenter Western imperialism and treat it as the pivot of modern world history. So in this narrative, the West remains the primary agency of human history in the past several centuries. Though unlike the modernization narrative, post-colonial studies does not see it as a beacon of light. Rather, the Western occupies the center of the gravitation field. So it's a visualizing the West. It is occupied the center of the gravitation field that has powerfully distorted the material, political, social, cultural, and intellectual spaces in other parts of the world. Second, this oversimplifies the West. We'll talk about this later. It also lumps together all other societies and cultures, non-Western, despite their vast differences. From a huge society like China to a small community anywhere in the world, from Siberia to Pacific Island, just because they have all presumably share the same fate of being non-Western, and therefore under Western colonialism or at least coloniality. Third, the actions of these societies then are reduced to responses to the West, based on the encounter studies and so on and so forth. Whether they are defined as resistance, appropriation, or instances of creativity, even in the study of what is called South-to-South interactions, there is that element in the room that post-colonial studies try often awkwardly to circumvent in order to make a case for non-Western or non-North actions and agents. But of course, the very categories of the global South and the non-Western are already defined in relation to the West or North. Fourth, in other words, the post-colonial narrative explicitly or implicitly accepts the conventional spatial temporal order of modernity. Although it proposes to critique it, this spatial temporality actually overlaps and is parallel to that of such narratives as the rise of the West and the spread of modern science, though again, it's seen through a critical perspective. So this periodization automatically divides world history into pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. And it automatically places European colonialism in the center of all history. That's why how we divide it into periods and that automatically we place it into the center of human history. So a truncated picture then fifth. In this framework, what is often marginalized is the complex history of a long-term regional and trans-regional developments, many of which can be traced farther back than Western imperialism, and then not all of which gravitate toward encounters with the West. So the substantial interactions among regional societies and cultures, and the rich and the complex power dynamics within and beyond a region that should not be consigned to the ahistorical notion of, say, for example, South-to-South and interaction and so on. So in a sense, I'm kind of arguing that we should break that mold and then look more broadly, and then we'll see that we don't tend to study only say each society encounters to the West, but there are many other things going on way back towards thousands of years, and that is very important part of oral history, global history. And without that, I argue we cannot understand global history science properly. So sixth, so it's entangled of the image and the attributes. So or the historical actors or the historian's view. For example, the concept of global south. An intellectual of say 19th century, 18th century China would have been puzzled by the geographic framing. They have their own worldview. Why not even categorize things the same way? That's the post-colonial framework. So the global south would not make any sense to them. Same with the many other instances that this is the categories that is the active kind of framework. And so if we traditionally post-colonial studies tend to have this entangled two different views of So then seven. Is it seven? So I keep going. So seven. Because post-colonial and the decolonial studies were first developed to explain and critically engage with the modern history of certain regions, the framework may not work as well in other regions. In East Asia, for example, there has been a shift in mosaic of multiple polar and multiple layer populations because post-colonial and decolonial studies position themselves mainly, maybe not exclusively, but mainly in relation to Western imperialism. They do not provide a well-rounded account of the historical situation in the region that involve traditional power relations, regional social cultural dynamics, autonomous imperialism, internal colonialisms, and so on and so forth. For all its shortcomings, area studies at least insist on taking the regional histories, cultures, languages, and societies seriously. These histories of the histories of these societies or regions absolutely did not begin with encounters with modern Western imperialism. So post-colonial framework tend to, as in practice, commonly often leave out that very rich and complex history. So eight, moreover, the encounter was not necessarily the most critical factor, that's what we call the West, was not necessarily the most critical factor in all aspects of the historical changes that the region has gone through. A great deal depends on the particular matters at issue, including what may be included in the categories of science, technology, and medicine. In short, we have to be cautious about the possible oversimplifications of post-colonial approaches. So, ninth, I must confess that I am also concerned about the uses and the abuses of post-colonial colonialism in my part of the world. So the anti-colonial theory and the rhetoric have, to some extent, been co-opted by certain intellectuals aligned with the political establishment to promote nationalistic or ethnocentric narratives. So this happened in China, India, Russia, and some African countries, for example, in their efforts to promote, for example, Hindu or Vedic science or particular narratives about Chinese science and so on. This is not to minimize the importance of historical and epistemological violence or justice. We must confront the violence, that is epistemological as well as other violence, in multiple forms and from different sources, as well as the harm that's been done to people in all different places. Yet it is also necessary to recognize the different social in other words, it's not one size fits all, which doesn't mean that the colonization is super important in certain areas, like especially in settler colonialism and more broadly as well. However, that this framework is it just applied to many other parts of the world without a more complex understanding of the historical processes. It would turn to still focus on, say, political society and the Western colonial power. Then you forget all the other power structures in that region, which play a very significant role on two different peoples. Their situations have been affected tremendously. So it's very important, in my view, since I'm coming from the part of the world, to remember these things. So finally, we have gone over many major problems or tendencies or limitations of postcolonial STS. So a major issue or oversimplification is that we have already is what we have already seen the tendency to resurrect the West-West binary. Another oversimplification is the assumed uniformity or unity of Western science in its episteme and power structure and ideology. So we seem to see, oh, Western science is like, oh, maybe they have unified some kind of a epistemology or methodology and so on and so forth, and therefore we can easily say, oh, we colonize it. But I'm not sure that is the case. We go ahead and learn science is really, if we have learned anything from the scholarship on the history of science and STS since at least the late 1980s, it would be that modern science is an umbrella category for a range of different activities, fields of inquiry, and epistemologies, methodologies, cultures, and practices. It is diverse, heterogeneous, and complex. For the reasons discussed about postcolonial science studies as its practice, falls short of the criteria of effective science studies that deal with the global. And so that's what I try to kind of argue. So how much time do I have? What's that? Half an hour. Okay. So I will skip some. Please go. Okay. All right. So here's what a brief summary what I just talked about, and these are the questions. Somebody's trying to get me out. No. Okay. Thank you, man. All right, so these are the questions I think we should keep in mind when we do global history science, even with the postcolonial kind of angle. That does this approach really have these issues that we can think about and so on. So this is this kind of summary. Now, so there have been several recent attempts to kind of add new layer to postcolonialism or try to strike out in different relatively different directions. So I probably have to shorten discussions on them, but let's see. So in recent years, a few alternative approaches have emerged that have drawn on postcolonial studies, but have also tried to strike out new directions. So one popular approach is the global history science, which is actually a catch-all phrase for a cluster of different approaches that range from old-fashioned world history to the global history of knowledge to approaches that emphasize global connections and the circulation. The last group intends to break down the more rigid binaries and replace them with movement, fluidity, and participation. The notion of circulation, for example, highlights how modern science must be produced in the transit of ideas, information, people, and material practices between places. Also, often though, as it's still tend to be the focus on metropolitan economies between India and Europe and so on. But yeah, similarly, the interest in go-betweens in cultural encounters has also been drawn from and is often compatible with postcolonial studies as with previous. Other related approaches such as networks and the sandwiches replace the more rigid hierarchy with something more distributive, contingent, and immutable. So I have discussed these issues elsewhere, so I won't talk too much about it here. But basically, overall, my beef, this is a right word, my beef, my bomb, with that is that I think they're, or tend to be anyway, historically thin. So that they're kind of use the image or metaphor to replace the actual historical kind of a, unpacking. So anyway, here's I'd like to mention my reservations about, here's comes back to Jim also kind of this point this morning. I'd like to mention my reservation about the recent trend in replacing history of science with history of knowledge. So we have learned to see science as something much more than just knowledge as such. It is also a complex of people, institutions, practices, material objects, and economic societal infrastructures. So history of knowledge runs the risk of it being materializing science. And that's what my research is about history of knowledge, so on. So another recent attempt, which has been developed from postcolonial study is provincializing, as TS is from Czechoslovakia, obviously provincialized in Europe. So I won't go into detail about it, we can talk about this later, but basically I will keep short is, I do not like it. Okay, so anyway, so in moving on, in this regard, a more historical grounded approach is Asia as method. Similar to postcolonial studies, Asia's method criticizes the traditional narrative of global modernity defined by Western interests. The original thrust of Asian as method is to write an alternative historical narrative of modernity. And here Asia does not usually refer to how we think about Asia as a geopolitical unit. It's sometimes it's more like a methodological and strategic positioning. But in any case, to achieve that, its modus operandi is to reconstruct the genealogies of certain seemingly modern concepts far back to traditional intellectual sources, as opposed to treating them simply as novelties introduced from the West and the data about encounter and so on. Is tend to trace far back before encounters the West to talk about how these things developed over time. And so basically the approach is to trace long-term evolution of a knowledge tradition and how this history helped us see modernity in a different light. So compared with postcolonial studies, Asia's method makes a more radical effort to reorient the spatial temporal order of modernity. So we try to see modernity as different from different spatial temporal framework. So and thus you center the West almost successfully anyhow. However, this approach can be very risky as it has been practiced among some scholars in East Asia. Asia's methods sometimes fell into Asia centrism or Sinocentrism even. Okay, so now done with that, and then move on to think. I'll give you a short example. Now, clearly, we need a more well-rounded framework than postcolonial and the decolonial studies to account for the global geopolitics of SPM, science and medicine, past and present. Take, for example, say zoonotic diseases, the hot topic today. The spillover and the outbreak narratives come out in both popular and even academic writings, often recycle many colonial tropes. For example, exotic nature, tropicality, for peoples in other parts of the world, when they talk about, say, bushmeat and so on, and the racialized germs, such as the Chinese virus. These topics have been studied extensively. So another perspective that emphasizes imperialism and colonialism is to see the zoonotic epidemics as an outcome of environmental degradation, urbanization, and the population movements caused by global capitalism and modernization. Similar unequal relationships are reflected in the science, patent ownership, and availability of vaccines across the world. These issues are, of course, extremely important and have generated a lot of scholarship. However, it should also be remembered that environmental exploitation and the degradation did not start with Western imperialism. A long-term history is highly relevant here. It depicts a different set of time, space, historical actors, socio-ecological dynamics, and the knowledge production. Take China, for example. For a couple of thousand years, the Han Chinese settlers have pushed into new ecological niches, overwhelmed the local human and the non-human populations, produce different set of dynamics from the Western postcolonial. Right, and they encounter new animal-borne diseases. As you can see, right, so here is the forest cover of this territory, the modern China, and you project to the past, and you can see the decreasing of the forest cover way before Western imperialism. For a couple of thousand years, the Chinese have been doing this, right? So in the process, they get the information from the local communities as well as their own experiences and produce knowledge about these diseases. So when the Nobel Prize winner Tuyoyo and here's Wendy is here, English has written a wonderful paper about Tuyoyo, and the third colleague searched for anti-malaria drugs in the 1960s and 1970s. They combed through ancient Chinese texts for information. Of course, this is not to say that it is what they did. So of course, this is not to say that the pressing problem with emerging zoonotic diseases is not new. In many ways, it is, yet still, it matters a great deal that the making of the current situation is dependent and long in coming. There is another reason why it would be unsatisfactory to see the global map of science solely through the post-colonial lens. The public pretensions that have involved fierce challenges to scientific establishment, despite its eager claim to knowledge, expertise, and academic authority, are rampant in Western society, notably the United States. The fact is that there is not an epistemic unity or hegemony, or even assured dominance of modern science in a society that likes to consider itself the powerhouse of modern science. The presumed epistemic and ideological hegemony of modern science has turned out to be both very powerful, but also very tenuous, and not aligned with a particular set of societies, for example, the so-called Western societies. Can we then say that a global scientific establishment imposes as epistemic and authority through institutional powers on a wide diversity of society in the world? So instead of should we turn the axis of analysis from regions such as East-West or South-North to social verticality, such as the global elite, versus say the subalterns and whatever, so the scientific elite versus that. Here, there is some value to this interpretation. The global techno-scientific establishment indeed tries to claim as peace and authority over certain domains of epistemic knowledge, materiality, and institutions. Yet this perspective clearly underestimates the heterogeneity of science, as well as the fissures and the frictions within the knowledge regime in a multipolar world. In any case, the model largely reproduces a narrative of global modernity that depends on top-down, some maybe downward process of modernization. So it also assigns too much coherence to a supposed global block of modern science. So here it is. Sorry. Okay. Try to draw this laptop on my airplane. Okay, so so this is why so you see this like this is like a Western science, and this is the rest of the world, so the rest. So you can see that here's it's the traditional view, even post-colonial analysis of Western science in the world, and it's like a, it's just like a bunch of different lumped together. Vis-a-vis that is supposedly to have some kind of coherence. And or you do it this way, that is a global scientific establishment versus that's why global scientific establishment the elite, so they wear glasses, and then this is the rest, and so on and so forth, right? So that's it's a different way. This I actually don't know what it is, but I mixed it up. But anyway, so I don't remember anymore. But anyway, so you can see that's a little like also whatever. So we can come into talk about it. But anyway, so. And oh, this is something else, but anyway. So conclusion, post-colonial SDS has been one of the most exciting and rewarding developments in the field in the past 20 years. It opened up new vistas for a generation of scholars, and many of us have learned a great deal from the approach. However, it should be clear by now that there are entrenched problems or tendencies and limitations with this interpretive framework. Particularly its spatial temporal order and its symbolistic historical narrative of science views and modernity. In short, post-colonialism and colonialism, powerful as they are, do not provide a robust framework for global science studies. We need something broader, more comprehensive, that allows more perspectives. So basically, history is messy and the world is patchy. So returning to my argument at the beginning, if you don't want to be a dog, you don't necessarily have to be a cat. You can be a sea cucumber, or indeed you can be a cauliflower. All right, so that's it. And questions? Right. Any questions? Or
I'll let you I'll hear your own questions.
okay. So as long as you don't throw shoes at me, it's fine. So the questions are great. I'm sorry,
Awesome. thank you for this. Now, you've already shown to us how, as researchers, we haven't done a really good job at thinking about our methodology. As teachers now, how do we make sure that how do we teach students so that they're not going to fall into those traps, even if we don't know yet how to solve this problem?
That's wonderful. Yeah, no, I agree totally. So, it's something I struggle with all the time in my own teaching, right? So what I used to do, is that I select a couple of, particular historical episodes. I start with the traditional one, the traditional Eurocentric one, and then I try to do it with the post-colonial one, and kind of juxtapose them, and say what other questions you might have with engaging with students in discussion, but the question you might have with either of them, or both of them, and then we go from there, and then through all these kind of questions to them. So I kind of let them work out things to think about, but I don't know if I teach, say, 300 students might be more difficult. I might have to provide answers to them. So yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
I'm just gonna. We'll let you have one question, but we have to have parity with everyone, so you were just fast. So you were just fast. So Letitia, we'll have you come and then we'll have lots of time in the roundtable tomorrow.
Okay. That's it.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how much we might do by just revising our language. So the word Western, maybe we should just get rid of it. It's an odd word, but it doesn't include the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere at all, right?
Right.
And so, can we solve this by just speaking more precisely? So if we're talking about European science, and even with European, right, often we really mean Northern European, or we really mean Mediterranean, or we mean Europe and West Asian. And so be more precise geographically, and be more precise when we're talking about things like colonialism. There's, obviously, the European colonial project in the last 400 years stands out for its impact and horror in a whole bunch of ways.
Right.
But there are other colonial projects that have impacted science, especially in different times. And so, should we just become more specific and careful in our language? Will that solve the problem?
So excellent point. That is, I totally agree with that. And be more precise as to what we actually talk about instead of simply using the imperative language of as traditional. Because postcolonial studies tend to, as a part of it, tend to use the same language and categories, but they just do it differently by trying to challenge that. So, and that is what I will be echoing you say, yes, let's just step back and think about these categories we're using. Are they useful or not? Are they misleading or not? Or are they kind of disguise many other things going on? And that is one part of it. And but however, I also think the model itself is really problematic in the sense that it's not simply about language, but the dynamics or dynamics, for example, is much more simplified than the actual complexity of how things was going on. And then third would be the framework itself. It's not related. The framework is to lead up a lot of things that maybe not necessarily directly related to what we might call Western culture. So in China, say in the 18th century or 16th century, there was a lot of encounters with the West. But we tend to look at that part and forget about all these other things going on in China that has to do a lot to do with quote unquote science, technology, and medicine. And without that part, we would not know very well what happened later, because that's where the basic larger context in which whatever happened. So in the sense that we still tend to orient toward looking at the West, even when we study the encounter and so on. And that is what I say, that's why I say area studies we have a lot to learn from area studies, because they do take this part more seriously. China and the Chinese interactions with all the Central Asia, India, and all the other things and so on. So that I also think that cannot be lumped together to call South to South or whatever other things, because that's not how these historical actors themselves solve the process. So that's what I would argue.
Or being,
All right.
being a hard taskmaster.
No,
So-
you.
So, we will have lots of time informally after this, and as I say, at the round table tomorrow, I think that Gordon probably has something to tell us about the next steps, but before I do that, please join me in